Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for our presentation on current educational issues. Should public schooling be redefined? By Natalie Marquez and Julia Straszewski from the Graduate School of Education at Azusa Pacific University. We would first like to begin discussing the components of public schooling. Public schooling serves both private and public purposes while also serving the needs of the individual as well as the state. In short, though, public schools are funded and controlled at federal, state, and local levels. Friedrich Hess took the affirmative on this issue in the 18th edition of Taking Sides. This article was refuted by Linda Nathan in both the 18th and 19th editions of this textbook. One of Friedrich's most important points included that successful democratic communities require a high level of literacy and numeracy and are anchored by the knowledge and the good sense of the population. Citizens who lack these skills are less likely to contribute to the well-being of their communities and are more likely to be a drain on public resources. Since we generally know what public schooling is and why it's important for a successful democratic community, what exactly makes schooling public? Some ideas Hess shared are that public schools are required to teach principles, habits, and obligations of citizenship of the home country. And some of these values can be based on interpretation, and sometimes these do not remain neutral. The supposed goal is to remain neutral in public schooling since America has a pluralistic culture. Private schools, on the other hand, do not have to remain neutral. Since they are privately funded, they are able to promote a set of values that they see fit. So when do the lines of remaining neutral become blurred? Does public schooling transcend the needs of individuals, or does it cater to it? Sometimes the private interests encroach on the public interests. Schools sometimes hire staff that advances and cultivates virtues they happen to prefer rather than serving public purposes. Let's stop for a moment and reflect on these ideas. What do you think can be done to protect public education from the private agendas held by staff regarding certain preferred purposes and virtues? Now that you've had a moment, let's take a look at what public schools should be teaching children. According to Hess, public schools should teach children the essential skills and knowledge that make for productive citizens, teach them to respect our constitutional order, and instruct them in the framework of rights and obligations that secure our democracy and protect our liberty. Any school that does so should be regarded as serving public purposes. It's important to note that these essential skills and knowledge can also be promoted by private schools, not just public schools. Hess's definition seems to exclude the difference between private and public schools is really because of funding and not necessarily essential skills and knowledge. Both private and public schools serve public purposes. In this excerpt, Hess neglects the idea that public schools could promote all of these things while also promoting their private interests. So what then? Hess's main argument is that the focus should be on maintaining and strengthening our commitment to public schooling and rededicating ourselves to essential principles of opportunity, liberal democracy, and public benefit, while freeing ourselves from political demands and historic happenstance. In other words, public education in the United States should promote American values and not necessarily biased private values that we hold. In his opinion, this should be the root of the reform of public schooling. So let's recap the ideas so far. Public school education comes from public funding, and Hess's main argument for public schooling reform is that it should solely promote American values for successful citizens rather than privately held virtues and purposes. Doing so promotes a successful democratic community in public schooling.
It's now time to consider the opposing viewpoint. Public schooling should not be redefined. Deborah Meyer states that we must make public education feel like a public enterprise again. Our school boards need to turn their eyes to their constituencies, not just following the dictates of state and federal micromanagers. Friedrich M. Hess makes the case that the time has come for a reconception of public schooling, while the opposing viewpoints perceive this to be an unproductive assault on public schooling. Instead, they choose to focus on the strengths of true public education. Linda Nathan says we need schools that will equip young individuals with the skills needed to be participants in a vibrant democracy. Public schools that remove competing private sectors will ensure that one-sided thinking is not the predominant view taught to students, but this will be a rather true public system that embraces diversity and includes all forms of thinking with all issues we face in today's society. As we look at this viewpoint, one of the questions we must ask ourselves is an education system that allows for vouchers, private schools, and/or charter schools really public? Public schools have a larger and more democratic purpose than private and parochial schools. Public school systems are open to everyone regardless of disability, wealth, status, race, or religion. Currently, those public schools that include the private sector are not open to all students. Admission standards such as entrance exams, socioeconomic status, and the private sector cherry picking does not allow for an equal playing field within the educational system. As we continue to explore this issue, we must remember that public funds do go to the private sector. So some questions that can arise for the advocates of public education are, since all public schools are not open to all kinds of students, what admission standards should be acceptable for schools supported by public funds? Another question is, shouldn't schools we describe as public accept and use some of the country's basic ideas to help improve education? These questions are hard to answer, but many of the opponents would agree that we do need to rethink and reimagine our antiquated American system of public education. We need to consider questions of definition, control, and funding, consider the threat of vouchers and privatization, and come up with a truly reimagined, genuinely democratic public system of diversity and choice. Evans Clinchey can summarize the arguments with this quote: "It is, I believe, the job of our local public school systems, assisted and encouraged by the state and federal governments, to provide a diversity of options. But the basic control of what goes on in all of our public schools must always remain solely in the public domain and solidly anchored in the will of the citizens of our local communities." It's now our turn to explore this issue further and answer the question, should public schooling be redefined? What do you think? Use these 4 questions along with any others we've presented to help develop your answer. In the forums, back up your arguments with claim from the text or any other information from this presentation, and together, let's continue to explore this issue.